Okay, fantastic. Well, welcome everybody. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Glad to see you all make it. The Australasian chapter of Computer Applications and Quantitative Methods in Archaeology, or CAA, is excited to host today's panel on developing a career in digital archaeology. My name is Tom Keep, and I'll be moderating our panel today. Just some initial quick housekeeping. By joining us today, you're agreeing to follow CAA International's Code of Behaviour, which I believe Simon will soon post in the chat. And we ask that you please mute yourselves, turn your cameras off, unless you're a panelist, and of course, be respectful to our panelists and also one another. In the first part of the panel will be presentations and moderated discussion, which will be recorded and uploaded to the CAA YouTube channel. The Q&A session at the end of the panel will not be recorded. Before we go further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I speak to you today from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Melbourne University, which is where I work, is situated on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Bunurong people, Dja Dja Wurrung people, and the Yorta Yorta Nation. And so now I was going to hand over to Josh, but unfortunately he is stuck in flooding in New Zealand. So I will quickly tell you about some of the things that CAA is working on at the moment, in particular the 2024 Auckland CAA conference that we're all very excited about. So as just a quick introduction to CAA, as I mentioned, we're a society for digital and computer methods in archaeology, and it's for, I suppose, fostering the development and communication between students, professionals, and academics with any interest in digital archaeology, whether you're a practitioner, whether you're just an interested person, or whether you would like to learn more about it. It's a really great place to keep in touch with what's going on in the field at the moment. You can become a member of CAA Australasia for free. I believe it is still for free at the link you can see on the screen there. And you can follow us on our many pages where we'll post about things such as these or conferences or advertise interesting articles or such things as that. On that note of articles, I should mention as well that there was recently a special issue in Australasian Archaeology published in the Journal of Computer Applications in Archaeology, featuring a magnificent article from one of our panelists, Katherine Thomas, and also another article by someone else who's on the screen. And then the most important thing of all is that next year in Auckland, you can see there from the 8th to the 12th of April, we'll be hosting the CAA International Conference, which we would thoroughly encourage you to come along to. It's going to be really great. We'll be having speakers from all around, but especially speakers from Australia and New Zealand. So it'll be a really good opportunity to see the kind of work that people are putting in and learn a lot more about the industry. And then finally, you've got our pages again there. I'll just go back to that first one. Okay, so in developing your career in digital archaeology, we'll be hearing from 3 speakers working in archaeology and cultural heritage more broadly, and specialising in digital methods used to discover, analyse, and present archaeological heritage in Australia and internationally. Our speakers have variously worked in consultancy, academia, and museum and gallery spaces, and I'd like now to briefly introduce them all. So Dr. Andrew Yip researches applications for immersive visualisation and experimental digital technologies for the preservation and interpretation of important cultural heritage sites, collections, and museums. He's interested in how we can use new media platforms to create new embodied sensory experiences that allow us to understand heritage in innovative ways. He is also interested in the mechanics of immersive design. His background is in art history and museums, and he works closely with the GLAM sector, that being galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, on digital conservation, exhibition design, and interactive design projects. Dr. Katherine Thomas is an experienced heritage advisor and a geographic information system specialist within natural and cultural resource management. Kath is skilled in GIS surveying, ground penetrating radar, photogrammetry, unmanned aerial vehicle flights, and legacy data management system consolidations. She is also focused on technical skill sharing and equality through closing the gap, including teaching heritage planning and GIS within adult education, undergraduate, masters, and community settings. Her PhD focused on GIS applications for archaeology, natural resource management, and traditional owners in the Willandra Lakes Region, World Heritage Area, New South Wales. And finally, Andrew Wilkinson is an archaeologist with over 15 years experience in heritage work throughout Australia, Singapore, Malta, and Italy. He's worked on Aboriginal, historical, maritime, and classical sites, where he has completed cultural heritage assessments, significance assessments, and heritage management plans. He has experience in conducting maritime, terrestrial, and aerial remote sensing surveys, and has a strong interest in innovative technology and in augmented, virtual, mixed, and extended reality development for exploring, educating, experiencing, and reflecting. So Katherine and the two Andrews will share with us details of their various specializations and careers in digital heritage and discuss some of the projects they have been involved with before we move on to a more moderated discussion. We'll finish with an open Q&A session where you can ask our panelists any questions you may have about their work or digital archaeology and heritage more generally. Questions can be posted in the chat at any time, or you can raise your virtual hand on Zoom, and one of the moderators will let you know when you can ask your questions verbally. Okay, finally, with all of that out of the way, I would like to ask Katherine if she's happy to start us off with our first presentation. If you have a screen share to go with, please do.
Hello, thank you, Tom. Thank you for such a great introduction. Now, I'm going to do a very informal presentation today and just talk through some of the things that have happened in the last 5 years within my career and how I got to this space of using digital techniques within archaeology. And I'd like to sort of go through this history this way, because I think we often rely on visual tools, and I just would like to do it as a bit of an oral history, because that is the work that I've been doing, which is trying to bring the qualitative data into the mapping and archaeological record. And I'd just like to talk about the oral history record and see how difficult it is to take this without the visual tools of GIS and mapping and all the tools that we as technical archaeologists bring to the profession. So without any props, I'm going to talk through my life history, and hopefully that will be a key point for showing how important the tools that the digital archaeologists offer is. So I started working in archaeology in 1994, and I worked on sites in Europe, specifically within the UK, and it became apparent to me that there was a bit of a skill gap with technical skills. So I thought it was really important to learn how to use theodolites, surveying equipment, and to start doing mapping. And my first mapping jobs on site were at an archaeological site called St Albans in the UK, where I was given colored pencils to draw out elevations of walls and colored pencils to draw site plans of where the different burials were, and also then the Saxon layers. And that basis got me interested in how we could better translate the archaeological record into mapped images, what computer techniques were there, et cetera, et cetera. So fast forwarding from that work and all the small find recording on archaeological sites in the UK, and then in places like Italy, like Portus. I did a master's in computer science, and that's when I first started using ArcView 3.1. And all the original Esri products, and trying to do early mapping of things like Roman inscriptions, taking the Latin words from those inscriptions to try and get an idea of the diffusion of where different, like the penetration of Roman archaeology across the provinces. So I did really, really early spatial modeling of diffusion of ideas, etc. Fast forward a little bit further, I came to Australia in 2002, and I started working in a completely different context. And I realized that all of the work that I'd done in southern Spain and in Italy, although technically was very useful, I had so much to learn about the traditional owners and the communities within Australia. So the skills that I brought here were my technical skills. My archaeological skills, they really were not, although technically useful, were not useful in this context. So I started working within cultural heritage consultancies within Victoria in the early 2000s, before the Aboriginal Heritage Act of 2006. So very early mapping of Aboriginal archaeological sites, and also flora and fauna. So doing the other side, all of the biocultural records as well. And that's how my career began to be shaped. And I spent many years working within mapping, specifically mapping, and then also teaching in adult education. Went back to the UK, teaching mapping in that space, and landscape studies. Then coming back here, and again, working within teaching, GIS, engagement. And I think that that's all led to finally leading to working in a PhD and looking at how we could bring oral histories, which is what I'm doing right now, into the archaeological record. And I worked in the Willandra Lakes. I was very fortunate to work with Dr. Nicholas Stern and Dr. Mal Ridges and Matt Meredith Williams, plus the Barkindji Muddy Muddy Nyampa, and I was able to work in those communities, and I was given an opportunity with New South Wales Parks as well to record oral histories and to start to try and bring cultural attachment mapping into the archaeological record, and separating the archaeological record from the cultural record, and also bringing in biocultural uses of plants. I've also spent time learning to become a drone pilot, and I'm now a chief remote pilot. And after finishing my PhD, I went into working in offshore wind and doing multi-criteria analysis of where we can do offshore wind sites. But now I work directly for a registered Aboriginal party, Taunarong Land and Waters Council. And as you can see, I've just come straight back from working in the field. And again, my role has, although now more directly within archaeology, I think that these skills that you get, if you can do any technical skills along the way, they're invaluable to understanding how we can best lean into and work to protect country. That's my presentation.
Great.
Thanks
Thank you
very
very much
much.
for sharing. It's great to see the development of it all as well. The kind of one thing leads to the next, leads to the next. I think that's always really interesting. You don't know where you're going to find yourself. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Next up, I'd like to invite Dr. Andrew Yip to please speak about himself and his work.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Catherine. I can see already that there's going to be a huge amount of crossover between all of us tonight, so that's really it's exciting. I have a PowerPoint. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
No? Yeah, you can. Okay, cool. Well, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm archaeologically adjacent. I'm a slashy, although my social handles are Indiana Drones, so I've got that. Broadly speaking, I teach immersive design, large-scale immersive visualization, interaction, and experimental data visualization and world building at UNSW, and I lead the immersive modeling research program for this insane visualization lab called the iCinema Center for Interactive Cinema Research, which you see in this picture here. And I also a fellow at a new lab called the Autonomous Media Lab, where we look at the sort of applications and politics and ethics of drones. So I have the dubious distinction of being the faculty's chief drone pilot, and we have submarines and things like that. So in October, I'm also an artist. So in October, I've got an artist residency in Bali, which is more or less a junket where I'm taking our submarine and doing shipwreck mapping for an upcoming exhibition on shipwreck hauntology. But my particular research interests are artifact reconstruction and exhibition. So I'm the front end person, and I work very closely with museums. My background was in museums, so I'm always interested in user-facing applications for site visualization. And I've done a whole bunch of different methods. So there's a picture of me at the top there in the particle accelerator, scanning a Renaissance painting of Bronzino. There's a Apollo 11 mission simulator I built for the Powerhouse Museum, and so on. And where my interest in archaeology lies is that I'm really interested in cultural heritage, site visualization, interpretation, simulation. I've been a curator on 2 archaeology or archaeological artifact exhibitions at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, going back 10 years. So that's where I originally became interested in the field, and have since worked on digs and on site preservation projects, which I'll talk about in a sec. So I'm really kind of very, very interested in archaeogaming and how we can build immersive platforms that are flexible across multiple hardware systems for public display as well as site analysis. So mostly I build large-scale interactive exhibitions like this at the South Australian Maritime Museum, involving historical object reconstruction. This is a massive, insane 64 square kilometre site reconstruction of the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux that I made using sentiment analysis and basically emotional algorithm visualization. An artwork I had recently in Penrith, which was a interactive evolving landscape, and some of the site reconstruction stuff I do, which is more, we're getting towards the archaeological bent here. This is a project I did for the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where I reconstructed this one kind of destroyed sculpture of Marjorie Hinders, and this other one extant but very damaged, and simulated the kinetics and aquatics of those sites and sculptures as a kind of digital conservation project for a big exhibition. My more to the point, I've been working on immersive mapping solutions for complex contested sites, I suppose. I'm working with a society called Arch Jerusalem, which aims to protect threatened heritage. And recently I've built this immersive archive map of an 1870s architectural model of Jerusalem in the Tower of David Museum, using the same immersive archaeological framework that I'm working on in Serbia. But basically, this is a real-time, multi-layered mapping system that allows you to correlate, as you see here, 19th century maps with 3D models. This is a big model of contemporary Jerusalem that you can switch between in real time, bring up archival information like museum curatorial information, and then do object inspection in 3D or 2D. And these kinds of things, and you can also walk around the worlds in one-to-one scale. So it's really scalable, can be put into a big cinema like iCinema or a museum environment or on a PC, and contains rich data. The idea being that over the course of a site excavation, we can build an evolving real-time interactable site that displays the kind of the evolution of the site over many years. This is the site in Serbia that I've been working on since 2017, although we've had a break for COVID, but we'll be back next year. It's called the Glatz Project, led by Richard Miles at Sydney Uni. And it's a massive, massive 3rd century Roman villa with what we think may be either a hippodrome or a theatre. It's got big fortified walls. The main building's I think almost 200 meters long. It's massive, thought to be the so-called lost palace of Emperor Maximian Herculius. And basically on site, I capture data, at every stage of the excavation, from ground penetrating. Well, I don't do the ground penetrating radar, but we have ground penetrating radar. We do lots and lots and lots of drone mapping in 3D and 2D, ground-based photogrammetry, object photogrammetry, and correlation of all the small finds data and all the metadata surrounding the site and objects. And the idea is to be able to produce this really, as in the Jerusalem example, a really compelling interactive 3D reconstruction, an archaeo game that allows us to visualize in real time, for example, here, the ground penetrating radar data overlaid over the trench models and site. It works in VR. So this is from 6 years ago. But this is, you can go straight down into virtual reality and wander the site at 1:1 scale. And within that, we've got embedded 3D objects that we record on site in a farmhouse, in a very sort of bodgy kind of 3D recording studio that I set up every year. So the idea is that we're able to do a top-to-tail digital pipeline that includes all the regular documentation of the site, as well as 3D recording of as many of the interesting small finds as we can, in order to build a rich database for future, public exhibition. But I also work with the GIS archaeologists in order to make sure that all the data is, shared properly across our proper, GIS database, as well as this, interactive system. So that's basically my interests. It's more user and museum focused, but I am, really, really interested in, the idea of top to tail digital workflows for multiple purposes on sites, and how we can use them for analysis as well as exhibition and engagement. I probably went over time, sorry. But I'll stop it there.
That's no problem at all. Thanks so much for sharing. And it looks like, unfortunately, our third panelist has not been able to make it. So it's no problem at all that you went.
It's all right, I'm here.
Oh, you're here.
Here,
perfect. There we found you.
It's come up as Griff for some reason. It's not my
That's
name.
great. We've been searching for you. Okay, well then, with no further ado, I'd like to invite Andrew Wilkinson to please introduce himself and his work.
No worries. If you could start the video for me.
Yep, let me just get this here.
All right, how's that?
We've got you.
Okay. Yeah, great. I'll just share my screen. Okay, my introduction is probably going to be a little shorter than the others. But I guess I started my interest in what's become digital archaeology well before I got into archaeology. And I used to work on the remote sensing systems for the P3C Orion aircraft for the military. They're a submarine hunting aircraft. We'll track ships, submarines, and do a lot of surveillance work. We used to repair the magnetic sonar, anomaly detectors, the infrared cameras, radar, and got interested in the aerial photography. And particularly with the aerial photography, I was interested in imagery analysis and how we could use that. Moving on to around about 2004, when structure from motion techniques really became freely available, I started looking into photogrammetry and creating these 3D models. There's a bit of a personal interest, but it wasn't until a bit later, a few years later, 2007, when I started studying archaeology, and I could immediately see some potential applications for photogrammetry techniques. Also with the background in remote sensing, I was just really interested in how digitally we could record information. But the thing that always struck me is you have this data, what do you do with it? And a 3D model looks absolutely wonderful. But like any sort of artifact that we have, it's the contextual information and what I call the metadata behind the object that really is of interest and importance to us. So I've always really been interested in, okay, having this data, making 3D models, things like that. That's one aspect of it. But you know, the other side is, right, how do we actually detail elements such as the fabric of an object, the textures, who used it, how it's used, you know, all this other information that really makes archaeology come to life. I got into heritage consultancy, and I found photogrammetry in particular is actually quite a useful tool. And even today, on a very basic excavation, I might just, if I've got time, take a few photographs, create a 3D model. And in a number of cases, this has really assisted me in going back and I guess, you know, fitting in details that you might have missed in your notes and things like that. Just having a bit of an issue with my PowerPoint for some reason. Are you able to see the slide with some photogrammetry models on it?
No, we're still in your first slide. I have them here. If you'd like, I could share my screen.
Yeah, maybe that'll work.
Yep, great. Give me one moment.
There we go. The first rule of thumb with digital archaeology is never trust the technology or the user. Yeah, thank you. So I guess in my career, quite quickly generated a bit of a name for myself with photogrammetry, and was invited to take part and do photogrammetry in a number of consultancy projects. So people in Sydney might be familiar with the Central Station cemetery that was excavated a few years ago, and a number of vaults were came to light and excavated, and you know, I came along and did some photogrammetry models of those. I was working in Brisbane about the same time, and we uncovered a brick-lined drain. About 2 o'clock in the morning, we're sort of recording this, and I just walked around, took some photographs, and created this photogrammetry model. As we did our plan drawings and things later on, there were just a few little questions that we had, and the model really showed us, you know, you could really zoom into areas and say, okay, yeah, that's how that particular brick looked, or something like that. So we could really make our illustrations quite detailed. Another project as part of the Wilkinson to Willandra upgrade with Jacobs. And we recorded in New Italy some stone-lined wells and other features as well. And just as a bit of a thought experiment, I just started playing around with 3D modelling software, Maya in this particular case, and just started throwing some interpretive ideas about how this well might have looked or been used. And it's entirely fictional. There's no evidence to suggest there's anything like that. But I was more interested in, okay, we have a photogrammetry model. What can we add to it to, you know, help us with our analysis and things like that? Most recently, I've become involved with it's a personal project, a private project, and that's looking at the restoration of a building in Malta called Australia Hall. It was built in 1915 and sadly suffered fire damage. Yes, the bottom right hand image there. And it's got this beautiful carved stone Australian coat of arms. Now, this building was built in 1915, but one of the questions we have immediately is, why is it showing the 1908 Australian coat of arms? Our current coat of arms obviously was registered in 1912. But the focus with this particular project is actually, in the first step, is really digitising as much as we can about this building. And there's a couple of buildings associated with the site, but collecting that data, and then the building's now under private ownership. So discussions with the owner is to use this data with the architects, conservators, structural engineers and things like that, so that we can actually restore this building and it can be used effectively for what it was always designed to be used, and that's as a recreational facility, although it's probably going to be more of a conference centre. And I guess the next slide, please. A big aha moment for me was in 2012 when I was working in Pompeii, and we took just a visit to a museum in Boscoriale. It's a suburb nearby, and in the 1970s, 1980s, they excavated this vineyard, Roman vineyard, which had been buried under Vesuvius eruption in 79 AD. And a disappointing thing at the time was that the building was under threat of structural collapse, so we weren't allowed inside. So the best I could do was just take my camera, walk around and take as many photographs as I could. And from that distance that you see there, so it's around the perimeter of the building, and it was a point shoot camera as well. So really it had, I think it was 6 megapixels or something, which is, I mean, it's pretty good for its time, I guess, but certainly not accurate these days. I had these photographs and I was sitting in the hotel room one night and just thinking, you know what, I took 79 photographs. I'm going to see if I can make a photogrammetry model out of this. Not really expecting with the camera I had to come out particularly well. And I was pleasantly surprised. It actually came out with a very nice model. I then did some polygon decimation to really cut down the overheads in the model itself. And when I got back to Australia, I actually imported this into a very early version of Unity. Wasn't particularly successful, and a few years later I revisited that and then started playing around with some of the geometry I had from the photogrammetry model and recreating the site and the building. I also managed to get hold of a copy of the archaeological report, which allowed me to recreate, again in a modelling software, the internal features of it, and ported that over to a virtual environment, which really was a bit of a game changer for me personally, because I could virtually now walk around this site and I could really test some of the interpretations and hypotheses put forward by the archaeological report and how these things might have functioned. And there are a couple of rooms in there which I didn't have much detail on, and therefore really didn't understand their function. And I started putting my own analysis and hypothesis together and visiting it's now been restored, and I visited the building last year, and yeah, some of my thoughts really, they made a bit more sense, I think, when I actually saw the reality of the construction. And then finally, Flinders University, there was a group there that produced this 3D volumetric projector called the Voxon VX1. And it's, I offered my 3D model to them and they put it into the machine to see how it works. So this is a device in the bottom right-hand corner there where you turn that dial there and you can actually rotate your 3D model around. You can play games and a whole range of things with this. It's quite an amazing bit of kit. And again, it's really sort of, really cemented for me that having this spatial data, I like to refer it to as photogrammetry models and things like this, what can we really do with it that can educate, entertain, the audience, but also allow people to actually reflect a bit on what they're experiencing. So particularly in virtual environments, the immersion's one element of it, but you know, you like to reflect on what you've seen, and from a technical perspective, I really like to get into these environments, virtually walk around and really think about what I'm looking at from a spatial perspective. How are objects in there used? How are spaces used? How did you move around a particular space? In consultancy, it's a little bit of a difficult thing to sell because particularly when it comes to development and infrastructure type projects, you know, unless your client has a real appetite for going a little bit beyond and giving something back to a community, they really only want the nuts and bolts approvals to get their development actually completed. What I'm finding very much just in the last few years, actually, a lot of especially government and larger projects, especially when there's a bit of contention about the development, there is a real interest in actually going that little bit beyond and giving back something to the community. And I've the couple of government clients actually that we have at the moment been discussing that they've got to remove some heritage listed items that are really just, they're falling into disrepair. There's really not much there that you can see that allows you to understand what the asset was, how it was used. But you've got these heritage groups, local heritage groups that really are still interested in this, and you know, many of them may have worked on a particular site or something in the past, so there's something quite important to them. So we're talking about, you know, bringing some of these ideas in recording what we have today, but then going back over old archival records and then trying to recreate something so that, you know, be it on a website or in a virtual environment, we have this recorded history, I suppose, that they can enjoy and reflect on, and it can be educational as well. So I guess that's really where I'm at. And probably just quickly, my latest project is again in Malta. We're looking at a Roman villa, which was discovered in the 1880s, and they built a museum on it. And with the Institute of Digital Exploration out of University of South Florida, we're actually recording not only the historical elements of this building, the artifacts within the museum, but also the archaeology that we're excavating at the moment. So it's going to be quite a significant holistic picture of this site, this archaeological site. And it's hoped that, you know, that allow a variety of products and things like that that people can enjoy in some way. So that's pretty much for it from me. So thank you, Tom. Back over to you.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. We have gone just a little bit over time, so what I might do is just see